great room full of people that I really care for so much, and new faces I'm excited to meet. And also special thanks to Kathy and to Katie for helping me to get to this place today, and also to the Department of Women's Studies for giving me a space in their coaching series. The title of my presentation is Kingdom of Games, the Digital Heterotopias of Saudi Women. It's based on a chapter of my dissertation. In this particular section of my dissertation, I'm looking at the growing subculture of Saudi women in digital gaming and game design and development, and how technological interventions in and on the body have the potential to destabilize existing gender norms and representations of sexual difference, to create new forms of desire and belief, and new orientations toward domestic and global politics within Saudi Arabia. I want to briefly situate this chapter within the overall project of my dissertation, which is titled Gamers, Hunters, Provocateurs, Digital Mediations of Violence, Gender, and Faith in the Arab World. Then I'll outline some preliminary arguments with regard to Saudi gamer girls as they self-identify, and my dissertation considers questions of embodiment and techniques, which I theorize through a concept of the interface. The interface is the central organizing concept of the dissertation. I use this concept in 3 different ways. So first, the interface can be a material object. So we can think of a keyboard, a computer, screen, your car's GPS system, or the touch-sensitive face of your smartphone. The interface presents electrical impulses that are coded as data to the user in a readable, understandable language. It's essentially a translator that allows for the flow of information and commands. However, simply thinking of the interface as an object or a screen implies a kind of boundary or a border between the user and the object that is being used. So if we want to understand how our digital interactions are also embodied interactions that also speak to a broader global reality, we need to understand the interface as an assemblage, or an exchange of flows between human and non-human forces that create a kind of self-organizing system of different states, different forces, and different entities. Consider the materials, the relations, and global flows of labor that go into your smartphone, from the extraction of minerals from the earth to shiny handheld device. Consider, for instance, the flows and forces at work in simply checking your email. The data streams, the transatlantic cable lines, the regimes of labor and language that speak to questions of access, and also your physical and neurological capabilities for movement and for sight. Third, the interface is a method or a conceptual tool for mapping layers of effects that speak to new spaces for locating digital politics, as well as the ethics that are implied in the particular material and socio-historical configurations that engender them, but are also created by them. So here we might think of Nicole's famous quote, "The medium is the message." So having just outlined a bit about what the interface is and how I'm using it, I'd like to briefly discuss the 3 specific interfaces that I explore in the dissertation. The first is the gamer interface, which I will explain here today in more detail. My chapter on the hunter interface examines the use of geomapping software by harassmap.com, which is a collection of online systems that are used for reporting sexual harassment in Egypt in real time via text messaging. Digital hunting techniques can become technologies of predation for predators well beyond the intended scope of victim and victimizer, as these danger maps enter into shifting relations of domination that are often hijacked by imperial and racial cartographies. So what do I mean by this? In other words, they can create an imperial image of the relationship between race and space. The spatialization of dangerous landscapes through geomaps can never be merely a technical process. The technical is often associated with data in its neutral phase, pre-interpretation, but data is never neutral. Instead, data generation, through its mapping interface with the particularities of the mappers themselves, reporters, victims, victimizers, and the geostrategic interests of great powers assembled to concentrate Muslim bodies, extremist households, dangerous neighborhoods, even whole national bodies in need of targeting. Subsequently, I argue, the logics of predation that legitimate drone warfare and the logic and practices of their HarassMap interface have more than a resemblance. I argue that harassmap.com joins with other cartographic practices of citing and targeting that all too closely resemble the missile and drone attacks that are launched in the name of women and women's rights abroad. They also each prescript a set of responses that undermine the desired attack on systems of privilege, systems of patriarchy, and gender and sexual norms. Mapping danger requires an ontological sleight of hand, whereby victimizing acts come to constitute victimizing beings who further come to constitute victimizing spaces. Although I in no way want to excuse or lessen the severity of rape and sexual violence, I also want to show the violence that is required for rendering individuals following HarassMap's categorizations of harassment touchers, noisemakers, verbal harassers, stalkers, and exposers as if that were their essence, and to illustrate the danger in spatializing that essence as a space of rape, rather than considering the complex assemblage drawn together by HarassMap as the differentially open space of the Egyptian street, which can be a street space territorialized and deterritorialized for authoritarian control, revolt, rape, new solidarities, gender reversals, sectarian violence, trans-sectarian solidarities, and so forth. What's at stake in my analysis here is the plasticity of victimage. To what extent can attempts to empower women be pursued at the micro level without amplifying the similarly inferior techniques of objectifying women as a resource for righteous military or police intervention? The question requires taking seriously the practices of mapping and targeting as an interface for political action in order to determine the degree to which seemingly progressive uses of these technologies can exceed the martial logic of their origin. The third interface, or what I call the provocateur interface, considers the use of nudity as a form of protest by Arab women in Egypt and Tunisia, and the role of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter in mediating these acts to both domestic and international audiences against the background of arbitrary and violent attacks on female protesters, forced virginity tests, and new conservative legislation directed at women's bodies. Amina Sabui and Aliyah Almadi are the focus of the chapter, similar to Ayaan Hirsi Ali's autobiography Infidel and her work with Theo Van Gogh on the film Submission. Amina and Ali's actions have frequently been framed as bold acts of feminist rebellion against an image of Islam that is inherently antithetical to women's rights. In this chapter, I take on the universalism that is presumed by Facebook and by the group Femin, who have effectively adopted these women as icons, based on a notion that bodies converge into this single cosmopolitan morality, whereby all people can enter social media platforms as equals. The bodily politics of these women's struggles stand in sharp contrast to the disembodied digital aesthetics of Facebook universalism and provide a necessary corrective to the liberal developmentalist discourses that imbue the arrival of the Western digital social network with the unexpected democratic uprisings of 2011. Instead of this techno-optimist and Western triumphal story of rebellion in the Arab world, I argue that these naked provocateurs and their adventures in the multitude of new digital and political interfaces illustrates how the seeming flexibility of place and identity in online activism often belies how the material bodies of women are violently targeted, even during seemingly progressive eruptions in the normative order. These naked images deterritorialize the female body from a post-Mubarak context, but they have been re-territorialized by Femin in a kind of anti-Islamic context that requires critical scrutiny. Following this, I attempt to elaborate on the material context of digital life to show that the interfaces between worlds drag particularity, history, violence, locality, and a multitude of ambivalences along into the sterile space of the social network. So I'd like to now move toward a more in-depth discussion of the gamer interface, but first, why focus on video games? Gaming is often coded by a particular set of assumptions, that they're masculine, Western, affluent, that they're sedentary, stultifying, and that it's an isolating activity. However, this picture doesn't really reflect the global reality of gaming. Almost half of people playing games are women today. There's also a growing number of people over the age of 50 who are playing digital games for fun, but they're also improving things like memory and cognition with gaming and also using it for things like physical therapy. Also, video games are a multi-billion-dollar industry with global reach. So in 2013, the total number of money spent on gaming worldwide, including software and hardware, was about $70.4 billion, with an average anticipated growth of about 6% per year. A slightly more conservative estimate puts the total projected amount spent on video games in 2017 at about $82 billion. And this number is growing, as are the number of people, both men and women, playing games. 1.2 billion people played digital games in 2013. That's roughly the entire size of the population of India. Also, contrary to the idea that games are an isolating activity or private form of recreation, gaming is incredibly social, as evidenced not only by massive multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft, which had 12 million subscribers in 2010, but also in the endless number of conferences that are organized around the world to bring gamers together in environments of fantasy, play, and competition. Games are also incredibly political. Many of you probably read recently about how the NSA and the CIA are actively profiling potential terrorists and those individuals thought to be susceptible to participating in terrorist activities in multiplayer games like World of Warcraft by posing as trolls, elves, and wizards. In the Middle East represents about $2.6 billion of the $70 billion global gaming industry. There are about 105 million gamers in the Middle East, and there's a growth rate of about 30% per year. So that's much more substantial than the 6%. I think part of that substantial growth rate is a reflection of demographics. About half of the population in the Middle East, 50%, are under the age of 25. There are about 8.5 million operative consoles in the Middle East. This excludes black and gray markets. So in reality, these numbers are much, much larger. Most gaming publishers and distributors focus solely on Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and the games, next to music, rank second among the most downloaded content in the Gulf. So in Saudi Arabia, women's bodies and activities are intensely regulated. However, gameplay and online gaming communities are largely overlooked by the legal and cultural apparatuses of the Saudi state, in part because these activities are considered a private form of recreation. So in fact, over the last 2 years, the Saudi state has actually helped to facilitate the creation of these gaming enclaves for women. Prince Sultan University in Riyadh sponsored the first women's gaming convention, also called G-Con, in April 2012, which had over 3,000 women in attendance. And the second most recent convention was held in October 2013, and that had even more people in attendance. Saudi gamer girls also have considerable online presences on social networking sites like Facebook, Twitter, as well, where they role-play, exchange gaming strategies, gossip, comment on new tech, and even invite questions about their personal lives on platforms like Ask.fm. Some are also pursuing careers in development in the interest of producing what they call culturally appropriate games. Now, in the United States and Europe, questions of feminine agency in Saudi Arabia generally center on the veil and also on the issue of rights. For instance, Saudi women's right to drive. I'm not offering a critique of these projects, but I am interested in how gaming interfaces can mediate new moves into visibility that exceed Europe and American-centric preoccupations with the veil. Some of the questions I'm engaging with are how the different patterns and pleasures of play are expressed in a range of online milieus that reflect micropolitics of becoming, that point to new spaces for technological agencies that can and do organize alternative modes of gendered agency. How might we think about this in the context of things like genre preferences or levels of skill and mastery? And how can we work out from an examination of individual experiences of play among Saudi women gamers in order to grasp the landscape of the military entertainment complex that enables relations of exploitation mediated by global capitalism, for instance, in the flows of migrant labor that enable a Saudi leisure class to be able to play these games. Also in the damaging ecologies of e-waste, which are a result of the purchase and throwing away a lot of these consoles, buying consoles, things like that. Finally, can play as both a concept and practice be used as a central category in the critique of empire and the military entertainment complex at the same time that it is being co-opted by it? So when we think of interfaces, they're often, again, considered spaces of demarcation between the body and a technological object. For instance, again, the face of a computer screen or a keyboard or a smartphone. These boundaries imply borders, they imply limitations, a kind of distinction between the engager and what is being engaged. Here I'm attempting to think through the interface with more emphasis on the inter of the interface, as a way to move away from mind-body dualisms that characterize disembodied virtual encounters, the increasingly outmoded oppositions of virtual actual, digital real, natural artificial, body machine, and so forth, toward a consideration of the body, sensation, affect, movement, and the conditions and differential experiences of space and temporality that emerge from particular digital encounters. This shift in emphasis marks how each participant in the interface, human and non-human, is affected by exchange and the flow of information across these spaces. Bernard Stiegler has called interfaces entry and exit organs that give us access to the networks of industrial memory, highlighting the living, intercalated characteristics of the interface through the metaphor of the body. Alexander Galloway calls interfaces autonomous zones of activity. Or to put another way, interfaces are not simply things, although they can be, but can more accurately be described as effects or events that bring about transformations in material states. Galloway also argues that it would be better to understand the computer not in the ontological sense of a definition, but rather as an ethics. He says, the computer takes our execution of the world as the condition of the world's expression. Here the computer, the video game console, the geomapping software, they're not simply objects or creators of objects, but are processes themselves and thresholds that mediate between different states or along different surfaces or layers, which themselves can also be interfaces. I put this concept of the interface to work in trying to understand the multi-layered interfaces operative in the practice of real gamers. Gamers don't simply play games. They upload digital video of their gameplay to social networking sites like YouTube. Others, like Samara Hussein, have themselves become developers. Hussein, along with a team of women computer science and math graduates, created the game Alien Adventure, which I'm going to feature here in just a moment, which won first prize in the Educational Game Development Contest at the most recent G-Con convention in Riyadh last October. In the game, an alien found by astronauts during a space exploration mission must use the laws of physics to find a way back to her home planet. One can certainly read the game metaphorically, as it is layered with meaning for the designer and those who play. But such a reading, I think, would be insufficient. What is interesting to me is how layered practices